I'm Elia's 32 male. I live in a minimalist apartment downtown, a space I designed to be the exact opposite of the sprawling, cluttered mansion I grew up in. By trade, I'm an architect, someone who builds things meant to last, which is ironic given how my family has crumbled. This story is about the day my father tried to bury me alongside my grandfather, and how the man we were mourning reached out from the grave to hand me the truth, not as a weapon, but as a blueprint for justice. Before this story unfolds, I'd love to connect with you. Please let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is in your corner of the world. It's amazing to see how far these stories can travel. The first thing you notice at a wealthy person's funeral is the silence. It isn't a peaceful silence. It's a heavy, oppressive quiet, thick with the weight of unspoken resentments and calculated sympathies. The air in the grand, historic church was cold, smelling of old stone, wilting lilies, and expensive perfume. I stood in the back, a stranger in a familiar room, my suit feeling less like a gesture of respect and more like a costume. It had been 5 years since I'd last spoken to my grandfather, Samuel, and a full decade since I'd exchanged more than a clipped, hostile sentence with my father, Julian. Yet here I was, drawn back by the inescapable gravity of death. My grandfather and I had been close once. He was a man who worked with his hands, an antique book restorer who saw value in what was old and forgotten. His workshop smelled of worn leather, aging paper, and the sweet, sharp scent of binding glue. He taught me how to feel the history in an object, how the slightest tear or watermark told a story. He was patient, deliberate, and kind, everything my father was not. Julian was a venture capitalist, a man who saw the world as a series of assets to be acquired, leveraged, or liquidated. He moved through life with a predatory energy, his charm a finely sharpened tool to get what he wanted. He'd always resented my closeness with his father, seeing it as a quiet judgment on his own life choices. The final schism happened when I chose to study architecture instead of finance. To my father, it was the ultimate betrayal, a declaration that I valued my grandfather's world of creation over his world of acquisition. He called me a glorified tradesman, and I told him I'd rather build something real than spend my life trading ghosts on a screen. We hadn't spoken since. Now standing in the back pew, I could see him in the front row, a perfect portrait of performative grief. Beside him sat my Aunt Genevieve, her face a mask of tragic elegance, dabbing at her dry eyes with a silk handkerchief. She was my father's sister, a woman whose primary occupation was maintaining the family's pristine public image. She'd always treated me with a cool, dismissive air, as if my chosen path was a stain on their reputation. They were the gatekeepers of the family narrative, and I was the chapter they had long since ripped out. People I hadn't seen in years filed past me, their eyes offering fleeting, awkward glances. Cousins, old family friends, my father's business associates. Some gave a slight, hesitant nod, others looked straight through me as if I were a ghost haunting the proceedings. They all knew the story, or at least my father's version of it. The ungrateful son who had turned his back on his family, breaking his grandfather's heart in the process. It was a lie, of course, a carefully constructed fiction designed to absolve Julian of his own failings as a son. My grandfather and I had grown distant not because of my career choice, but because Julian had systematically poisoned our connection, twisting my words, intercepting my letters, and feeding Samuel a steady diet of subtle falsehoods about my life. The last time I'd tried to visit, my father had met me at the door and told me Samuel was too frail for the stress of seeing me. A lie I later learned, but one I had been powerless to fight from a distance. I felt a presence beside me and turned to see Ms. Evelyn Reed, my grandfather's estate lawyer. She was a poised woman in her early 50s, with sharp, intelligent eyes that missed nothing. She had always been a friend to Samuel, not just an employee. "Elias," she said, her voice a low murmur that barely disturbed the funereal hush. "I'm glad you came, he would have wanted you here." "I'm not so sure about that," I replied, my gaze drifting back to my father. "The official story is that I'm the reason he's gone." Ms. Reed's expression tightened for a fraction of a second. Samuel was a man who valued truth above all else, remember that. She gave my arm a gentle squeeze before moving to take her seat, leaving me to ponder her cryptic words. The organ music swelled, a mournful, cascading sound that filled the cavernous space. The service began. The priest spoke of Samuel's generosity, his quiet contributions the community, his love for history and art. It was a generic, polished tribute that captured the man's public persona but missed the essence of him entirely. It said nothing of the mischievous twinkle in his eye when he told a bad joke, or the way his calloused fingers could handle a fragile, centuries-old page with impossible gentleness. Then it was time for the eulogies. Aunt Genevieve went first, her voice trembling with practiced emotion as she recounted idyllic family holidays, painting a picture of a perfect patriarch in a perfect family. It was a performance and she was flawless. Then my father, Julian, walked to the lectern. He adjusted the microphone, his movements slow and deliberate. He looked out over the congregation, his gaze sweeping across the faces of the mourners until, with chilling precision, his eyes found and locked onto mine in the back of the church. A cold knot formed in my stomach. I knew with absolute certainty that this was not for Samuel. This was for me. My father stood at the lectern, bathed in the soft, forgiving light filtering through the stained glass windows. He looked every bit the grieving son's somber suit, appropriately solemn expression. But his eyes, when they met mine, held a glint of something cold and triumphant. The air in the church grew still, the collective breath of the mourners held in anticipation. I could feel dozens of eyes discreetly turning my way, a ripple of curiosity spreading through the pews. They knew our family's schism. They were waiting for the dramas. My father, Samuel, Julian began, his voice rich with a carefully manufactured sorrow. He was a man of principle, a man who built a legacy from nothing but his own two hands and an unshakable belief in the value of heritage, of family. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. He believed that a family was a structure built on a foundation of loyalty, respect, and duty. He dedicated his life to building that structure, to ensuring it would stand for generations. He spoke for several minutes about Samuel's early life, his dedication to his craft, his love for his late wife. It was all true, but it was hollow, delivered like a well-rehearsed business pitch. He was laying the groundwork, establishing the moral high ground before launching his attack. I felt my hands clench into fists at my sides, my knuckles white. I knew what was coming. I had known it the moment he locked eyes with me. But a structure, no matter how well built, can be damaged, Julian continued, his voice dropping to a near whisper, drawing the audience in. It can be undermined from within. Cracks can form when the foundation is disrespected, when loyalty is abandoned for selfishness. His gaze, which had been sweeping the room, returned to me with the force of a physical blow. He didn't need to say my name. Every person in that church knew who he was talking about. My father loved his grandson, he said, and the lie was so audacious, so public, that a gasp escaped my lips, quiet but sharp. He loved Elias dearly. He saw a future for him, a place for him within the legacy he had so carefully built. All he asked for in return was respect. Not obedience, not conformity, but the simple respect of acknowledging the sacrifices that were made for him. The narrative was so twisted, so perfectly inverted, that I felt a wave of dizzying disorientation. He was painting my grandfather as a demanding patriarch and me as a rebellious child, erasing the years of genuine love and connection we'd shared before Julian had systematically severed it. But that respect never came, my father declared, his voice rising with righteous indignation. Instead, my father was met with rejection. His values were mocked, his life's work was dismissed, his love was thrown back in his face in pursuit of a fleeting, selfish ambition. He spat the last words out, his face contorting into a mask of pain that was utterly convincing to everyone but me. I could feel the weight of 100 pairs of eyes on me now. I was no longer an anonymous mourner in the back. I was the focal point of the drama, the villain in the story. I could see the judgment in their faces, the pity, the quiet condemnation. They were believing it, of course they were. Julian was a master of perception. In his final years, Julian's voice cracked, a masterful touch of theatricality. My father was a man in pain, not just the pain of an aging body, but the deep, spiritual pain of a broken heart. He would wait by the phone for calls that never came. He would look at old photographs with a sadness that was terrible to witness. He paused, taking a deep breath as if to steady himself. This stress, this constant, unending heartache, it took its toll. The doctors can give you medical reasons for his decline. They can talk about his heart, his blood pressure. But I know the real reason. I saw it every day. He died of a broken heart. And then came the F's. Inal, brutal strike. He looked directly at me, his eyes burning with a cold fire, and his next words were not for the congregation but solely for me. And we all know who broke it. The accusation hung in the hallowed air of the church, monstrous and undeniable. A collective, quiet gasp rippled through the pews. It was no longer an insinuation, it was a public execution. He had just, in front of everyone we had ever known, blamed me for my grandfather's death. Something inside me snapped. The carefully constructed wall of composure I had maintained for years crumbled into dust. The air was suddenly too thick to breathe. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. The hushed whispers, the turning heads, the piercing stares, it was all closing in on me. I felt hot, then cold, my vision swimming at the edges. I couldn't be here. I couldn't listen to this. I couldn't let them all stare at me as if I were a murderer. Without a conscious thought, I turned. My movements were stiff, robotic. I walked out of the pew, my footsteps echoing unnaturally loudly on the ancient stone floor. Every head turned to watch me go. I didn't run, but I walked faster than I ever had in my life. I pushed open the heavy oak doors and stumbled out into the blindingly bright afternoon, gasping for air that still wouldn't come. I leaned against the cold stone wall of the church, the sound of my own ragged breaths filling my ears, the image of 100 accusing faces burned into my mind. My father had won. He had painted his masterpiece, and I was the ugly, brutal stain at its center. The world outside the church was a blur of harsh sunlight and indifferent city sounds. I walked for blocks without any destination in mind, my tie loosened, my jacket slung over my shoulder. Each step was an effort to put distance between myself and the suffocating weight of my father's words. The scene played on a loop in my head, the collective gasp, the sea of judgmental eyes, the chilling finality of Julian's accusation. He hadn't just estranged me, he had branded me. In the minds of our entire community, I was now the boy who killed his grandfather with cruelty. I finally found myself sitting on a park bench, watching children play on a swing set, their innocent laughter a stark contrast to the ugliness churning inside me. My phone had been buzzing in my pocket for the better part of an hour, Aunt Genevieve no doubt calling to deliver a lecture on the scene I'd caused. Or perhaps it was an old family friend offering condolences laced with thinly veiled disapproval. I ignored it, letting the calls go to voicemail. There was nothing anyone could say. My father had set the narrative in stone. Hours later, the sun began to dip below the skyline, painting the clouds in shades of orange and purple. The anger and panic had subsided, leaving behind a hollow, aching exhaustion. I felt utterly defeated. Maybe my father was right, not about the cause of death, but about me. I had left, I had stayed away. I could have fought harder, tried to break through the wall he'd built between my grandfather and me. The regret was a bitter pill. Finally, I forced myself to stand and head back to my apartment, a sterile sanctuary that felt more like a refuge than ever. As I unlocked the door, the silence that greeted me was a relief. I tossed my keys on the counter and sank onto my sofa, staring blankly at the wall. The buzzing started again. I pulled out my phone, ready to turn it off, but the notification on the screen wasn't a call. It was an email. The sender was Evelyn Reed. The subject line was simple, stark, and utterly arresting, from Samuel. My breath caught in my throat. Ms. Reed, the lawyer. Her words at the church came rushing back. Samuel was a man who valued truth above all else, remember that. My hands trembled as I tapped open the email. It was brief, almost clinical, but every word carried an immense weight. Dear Elias, pursuant to your grandfather's instructions, I am contacting you following the conclusion of his funeral service. He was very specific about the timing. Samuel left a private addendum to his will, one that he recorded himself several months ago. He stipulated that it was to be sent to you and only you at this exact time. He referred to it as his final restoration project. He wanted you to see the truth in his own words. Please find the secure video link below. My deepest condolences on your loss. I hope this brings you some measure of peace. Sincerely, Evelyn Reed. Below her signature was a hyperlink. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my temples. A video, a final restoration project, the phrases echoed my grandfather's language, his way of seeing the world. It was a message from the grave, a digital ghost reaching out through the ether. For a long moment, I just stared at the screen, a storm of emotions raging within me, fear, hope, grief, and a desperate, burning curiosity. What could he possibly have wanted to say to me that he couldn't say in life? Was it a final, posthumous condemnation, a confirmation of everything my father had claimed? The thought was terrifying. If my own grandfather believed I had abandoned him, then the truth wouldn't matter. My father's lies would become my reality. But then I remembered the man who taught me how to read the stories in worn leather and faded ink. The man who believed that everything, no matter how damaged, could be understood and restored. This was his final work. He wouldn't have sent it to hurt me. Ms. Reed's words, "He valued truth above all else," echoed again, a refrain of hope. Taking a deep, shaky breath, I got up and walked to my desk. I opened my laptop, my fingers fumbling as I typed in my password. I forwarded the email from my phone to my computer and clicked the link. A secure portal opened, asking for a password. What could it be? My mind raced through birthdays, old addresses. Then it hit me. A word only Samuel and I would know. During one summer, I had helped him restore a rare first edition of Moby Dick. We'd spent weeks on it, and he'd nicknamed the project Ahab. I typed it in. The portal accepted it, a video player loaded on the screen. The thumbnail was a still image of my grandfather. He was in his workshop, sitting in his favorite worn leather armchair. He looked older, frailer than I remembered, but his eyes, even in the low-resolution image, held the familiar spark of intelligence and warmth. He was looking directly into the camera, as if he were looking right at me, waiting. My hand hovered over the play button, the cursor trembling. This was it. This video held the truth for better or worse. It could either validate my father's public crucifixion of my character, or it could give me the one thing I desperately needed, a reason to believe I hadn't failed the one man in my family I had ever truly loved. With another ragged breath, I clicked play. The video flickered to life. The image was stable, clearly filmed on a tripod. My grandfather Samuel filled the frame. He was in his workshop, the familiar, comforting chaos of his life's work surrounding him, stacks of old books, jars of pigments, rolls of leather, and the faint, dusty light from the high window catching the silver in his hair. He looked tired, the lines on his face carved deeper than I remembered, but his voice when he spoke was as steady and clear as ever. "Hello, Elias," he began, a faint, sad smile touching his lips. "If you are watching this, then I'm gone. And if Evelyn followed my instructions, then you have just come from my funeral. I imagine it was a difficult experience. I know my son." The directness of his words sent a shiver down my spine. It was as if he were sitting in the room with me. "I'm recording this," he continued, folding his hands in his lap, "because I have spent the last few years failing you. Not in my heart, son, never there, but in my actions. I have allowed a story to be told that is not the truth, and my silence has made me complicit. This is my attempt to restore the facts, my final restoration." He took a slow breath, his gaze momentarily drifting past the camera, as if lost in a painful memory. "Your father, Julian, has always been a complicated man. He sees love as a transaction, a currency. When you were born, he saw you as an extension of himself, another asset. But you were my grandson. You were a craftsman's soul in a banker's family. You understood my work. You had the patience for it. That, I think, is something he could never forgive either of us for." He looked back at the camera, his eyes filled with a profound regret. "When you went off to study architecture, I was so proud. You were going to build things, Elias, beautiful, lasting things, but Julian framed it as a betrayal. He began to tell me things, small at first, that you were too busy with your new, important life to call, that you were dismissive of the family. He would pass on messages from you that were always cool and distant. When I wrote to you, I rarely got a reply. He told me you were throwing my letters away." My blood ran cold. The intercepted letters, the twisted messages, it was exactly as I had suspected, but hearing it from him was a different kind of pain. It was real. "I am an old man," Samuel said, his voice laced with self-recrimination. "And I became a foolish one. I started to believe him. It was easier than confronting the alternative, that my own son was a liar, a manipulator, a man so poisoned by jealousy that he would sever the bond between his father and his grandson. But the truth has a way of showing itself if you're willing to look." He explained that about a year ago his health had taken a turn. Julian had used it as an excuse to isolate him completely, managing all his calls and visitors. But one of the nurses, a kind woman named Maria, had grown suspicious of Julian's behavior. She saw how he would hang up the phone whenever she entered the room, how he spoke of me with such vitriol. One afternoon she found a box of my letters, unopened, hidden in a closet in the guest room. She brought one to my grandfather. "It was a letter UD sent for my birthday," Samuel said, his voice thick with emotion. "You wrote about a building you were designing, how its foundation was inspired by the structural techniques we'd studied in old architectural books in this very workshop. You told me you missed me. You asked why I hadn't replied to your last 5 letters." He paused, and for the first time I saw tears welling in his eyes. He wiped one away with the back of his hand. "That was the day the fog cleared, Elias. The cruelty of it all, it was breathtaking, to steal years from us, to make us believe we were abandoned by one another. I confronted Julian. He didn't even bother to deny it. He said he was protecting me from the disappointment you represented. He told me you had your own life and that I was a burden he was trying to spare you." The audacity of the lie was staggering. My father hadn't just lied. He had weaponized his role as a caregiver to complete my exile. "After that, I knew I had very little time," Samuel continued, his voice regaining its strength, a new steely resolve in his tone. "Julian controls my finances, my access to the outside world. To fight him openly would have been a messy, public battle that I no longer had the strength for, and worse, he might have found a way to have me declared incompetent, to silence me for good. So I decided to do what I have always done. To work quietly, carefully, and to let the truth speak for itself when the time was right." He leaned forward slightly, his eyes boring into the camera lens. "Which brings me to the will, Elias. My official will, the one Julian and his sister Genevieve will hear, leaves the bulk of my estate, including the family home and my controlling shares in the original business, to your father. It is exactly what he expects." My heart sank, so that was it. Julian had won after all. "But," my grandfather said, and a sly, familiar twinkle appeared in his eye, "that will contains a single peculiar clause. Clause 11b, it stipulates that the final transfer of all assets is contingent upon a family reconciliation review. to be conducted by my executor, Ms. Reed, within 30 days of my passing. The clause is deliberately vague. Julian will assume it's a mere formality, a sentimental old man's dying wish for his family to get along. He smiled, but it is not a formality. It is a locked door. And this video, Elias, this is the key. I have given Evelyn Reed a second notarized document. It states that the reconciliation is only satisfied when you, Elias, confirm that you have been made aware of the full circumstances of my final years. This video is my testimony. It proves that the estrangement was a lie manufactured by Julian. By the legal terms I have laid out, he cannot inherit a single penny until you are satisfied with the truth. You, my boy, are now the executor of your father's inheritance. The room spun. I leaned back in my chair, my mind reeling. It wasn't revenge, it was something far more elegant. It was justice, crafted with the same precision he used to restore a 16th century manuscript. He hadn't disinherited my father. He had made Julian's inheritance dependent on me. He had given me all the power. What you do with this power is up to you, Samuel concluded, his expression softening. You can expose him, you can forgive him, you can make your own terms, that is your decision to make. All I wanted was to give you back the truth that was stolen from you. I love you, Elias, I have always been so proud of you. Don't ever let him make you doubt that. The screen went black. The silence in my apartment was deafening. I sat there for a long time, the glow of the laptop illuminating the tears streaming down my face. They weren't tears of sadness or anger anymore. They were tears of relief, of vindication, of a deep and profound love for the grandfather who had, in his final act, restored not a book but my life. The weight of my father's accusation was gone, replaced by the weight of the truth, and it felt like a foundation I could build on. The morning after watching the video, I woke up feeling like a different person. The hollow ache in my chest had been replaced by a quiet, solid core of purpose. The grief for my grandfather was still there, but it was now mingled with an overwhelming sense of gratitude and a cold, clear anger. For years, I had been a passive character in my father's narrative, the disgraced son. Now my grandfather had handed me the pen and a blank page. I spent the next 2 days in a state of intense, focused calm. I didn't answer the still frequent calls from my aunt or the tentative text message olive branches from cousins who had likely been ordered to reach out. I needed to think. Why grandfather's plan was brilliant in its simplicity. He hadn't just exposed a lie, he had created a perfect legal trap, and I was the one holding the key. My first call was to Ms. Reed. When she answered, her voice was professional but warm. Elias, I was hoping you would call, she said. I watched the video, I said, my voice steady. I thank you for helping him. It was an honor, Elias. Your grandfather was a remarkable man. He was playing chess while everyone else was playing checkers. So the question is, what is your next move? We spoke for over an hour. She patiently walked me through the legal intricacies of Clause 11b. The wording was, as my grandfather had said, vague enough to be initially dismissed by Julian as sentimental nonsense. But Ms. Reed confirmed it was ironclad. The family reconciliation review was entirely at her discretion as executor, and her discretion was bound by the second, private document which named me as the arbiter. Without my signed confirmation that I was satisfied, the entire inheritance, the mansion, the stock portfolio, the legacy my father had craved his entire life, would remain frozen in the estate indefinitely. Your father has already been in touch, of course, Ms. Reed told me. He's pressuring me to expedite the probate process. He wants to liquidate some of Samuel's assets to fund a new venture. He has no idea that his entire financial future is currently sitting in your inbox. That piece of information solidified my plan. My father wasn't just greedy, he was impatient. He saw my grandfather's death not as a loss but as a liquidity event. He was already planning how to spend the money. That would be his weakness. I am an architect. I solve problems by designing systems. I create blueprints that anticipate stress points, that channel flow, that lead to a predetermined outcome. My father's downfall would be no different. I wasn't interested in a screaming match or a messy public feud. That was his style. Mine would be quiet, deliberate, and devastatingly precise. My revenge would be a structure, and I was going to build it brick by brick. The first step was to establish the terms. I told Ms. Reed that I would be willing to attend the reconciliation review, but I had conditions. First, it had to be a formal meeting at her office, not a family ambush at the house. Second, the only people present would be myself, my father Julian, my Aunt Genevieve, and Ms. Reed. Genevieve had to be there. She was my father's chief lieutenant in the campaign of lies, the keeper of the family's public image. She needed to witness its dismantling. Third, and most importantly, I would not say a word about the video. My power lay in the information asymmetry. They believed I was coming to the table as a broken, disgraced pariah, perhaps to beg for forgiveness or a small piece of the inheritance. They would be walking into a hearing, expecting to be the judges, only to find they were the ones on trial. For the next week, I prepared. I watched my grandfather's video another dozen times, transcribing key phrases, memorizing the timeline of deceit he had laid out. I gathered the evidence of my own attempts to connect. Copies of emails I had sent to my grandfather that had gone unanswered, phone records of calls that were never picked up. I even found a returned, unopened Christmas package I had sent 2 years ago, marked "Return to Sender" in a handwriting that was distinctly not my grandfather's. It was my father's. I also did something my grandfather would have appreciated. I researched. I looked into the new venture my father was so eager to fund. It was a high-risk, speculative real estate development, and from what I could gather from public filings, he was over-leveraged. He wasn't just impatient, he was desperate. He needed my grandfather's money, and he needed it soon. This was the final piece of my design, the pressure point. The day before the meeting, I designed the final symbolic element of my plan. Using the CAD software on my computer, I drafted a simple, elegant document. At the top, I wrote terms of reconciliation. Below, I listed my conditions. They were not about money. I didn't want a cent of it. They were about the truth. My design was complete. It was a quiet, inescapable room with only one door. And to open that door, my father would have to do the one thing he had spent his entire life avoiding. He would have to tell the truth, and he would have to say it to me. The architect in me was satisfied. The structure was sound. All that was left was to invite them inside and lock the door behind them. The law office of Ms. Evelyn Reed was exactly what you would expect, tasteful, quiet, and exuding an air of unshakable competence. I arrived 10 minutes early, my heart a steady, rhythmic drum in my chest. I wasn't nervous, I was ready. I wore a simple, dark suit carrying a slim leather portfolio containing the documents I had prepared. When Reed greeted me, she gave me a small, encouraging nod. "They are in the conference room," she said quietly. "Remember, you are in control." I walked in. The room was dominated by a large mahogany table polished to a mirror sheen. My father, Julian, sat at its head looking impatient and authoritative. My Aunt Genevieve was beside him, her posture rigid, a look of strained pity on her face. They both looked up as I entered, and I saw a flicker of surprise in my father's eyes. He had expected me to be stooped, broken, perhaps even tearful. Instead, I met his gaze directly, my expression calm and unreadable. I took a seat opposite them, placing my portfolio on the table. Ms. Reed sat between us at the side, a neutral arbiter in the proceedings. "Well," Julian began, foregoing any greeting, "let's get this unfortunate business over with. Elias, I'm glad you agreed to this. This reconciliation clause was a bit of sentimental foolishness on my father's part, but we must honor it. I am prepared to accept your apology." The arrogance was stunning. He genuinely believed he was in a position to grant me forgiveness. Genevieve nodded in solemn agreement. "We all are, dear," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. "What you did at the funeral was terribly public, but family is family. We forgive you." I let the silence hang in the air for a long moment before speaking. My voice, when it came, was quiet but firm. "I'm not here to apologize." Julian's eyebrow twitched. "I beg your pardon." "There's no need," I said calmly. "You heard me correctly. I have nothing to apologize for, but I am here for a reconciliation. I am here to be reconciled with the truth." I opened my portfolio and slid a single sheet of paper across the table towards him. It was the terms of reconciliation I had drafted. Julian picked it up, a frown creasing his forehead. Genevieve leaned over to read it with him. I watched their faces as they scanned the document. Confusion, then irritation, then outright disbelief. "What is this?" Julian finally sputtered, tossing the paper onto the table as if it were contaminated. "This is absurd. A full public retraction of the eulogy, a written admission of the deliberate interception of correspondence. Are you insane?" "Those are my terms," I said evenly. "If you want me to sign the document satisfying Clause 11b, that is what it will cost you." Genevieve scoffed. "You're in no position to make demands, Elias. You are a pariah. After your display at the funeral, you have no credibility left." "My credibility isn't what's on trial today," I replied, my gaze fixed on my father. "Yours is." Julian laughed, a harsh, humorless sound. "This is a pathetic shakedown. You think you can hold my father's will hostage over some petty family squabble? Evelyn," he said, turning to Ms. Reed, "surely you can see this is ridiculous. He's being vindictive, just override him." Ms. Reed looked at him coolly. "I'm afraid I can't do that, Julian. The terms of the trust are explicit. The executor's actions are bound by the reconciliation review, and the private addendum is very clear on how that review is to be satisfied. Elias holds all the cards. The reality of his situation began to dawn on my father. The bluster faded from his face, replaced by a dark, simmering rage. You little, after everything I've done for you, you try to extort me. What have you done for me? I asked, my voice still quiet but now edged with steel. Have you done more for me than you did for my grandfather in his final years? Let's talk about that. Let's talk about the letters. Let's talk about the phone calls you screened. Let's talk about the lies you fed to a lonely old man. Genevieve gasped, "How dare you?" Julian devoted himself to caring for his father. He devoted himself to isolating him, I shot back, my eyes never leaving Julian's. He built a prison around him and called it care. My father stood up abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. This meeting is over. I will not be slandered by my own son. Sit down, I said. The two words were not loud, but they carried a command that made him freeze. If you walk out that door, you will never see a single dollar from that estate. Your high-risk development deal will collapse and your creditors will have a field day. I know you're desperate. I know you need this money. The color drained from his face. I had him. The final piece of the structure had clicked into place. He slowly, reluctantly sat back down. His mask of control was gone, replaced by the naked panic of a cornered animal. What do you want, Elias? He asked, his voice a low growl. I told you, I said, tapping the paper on the table. I want the truth, not for the public, not anymore, for me, right here, right now. I want you to look me in the eye and tell me why you did it. The silence in the room was absolute. Genevieve looked back and forth between us, her composure finally cracking. My father stared at the polished surface of the table, his jaw clenched. He was at war with himself. Decades of pride and arrogance were battling against the cold, hard reality of his financial ruin. Finally, he looked up at me, and for the first time in my life, I saw something in his eyes other than contempt or disappointment. I saw defeat. He always chose you, he whispered, the words ragged and raw with a lifetime of resentment. He was a book restorer, a craftsman, and you were the same, you understood him. He looked at you and he saw himself. When he looked at me, all he saw was a disappointment. I built an empire in a world he never respected and it was never enough. You abandoned him and he still loved you more. It was a confession, poisoned by bitterness and self-pity, but it was the truth. It was the rotten, decaying core of it all. He hadn't done it to protect his father, he had done it to punish him, and to punish me. I took a deep breath, the confession settling over me. It wasn't a victory, it was just a profound, hollow tragedy. Sign the admission, I said to him, my voice devoid of emotion, and I'll sign the release for the estate. Ms. Reed slid a pen and a freshly printed copy of my terms in front of him. His hand trembled as he took the pen. He didn't look at me, he didn't look at his sister. He just stared at the paper, the final invoice for his life's jealousy. Then with a scratch of ink on paper, it was done. He had signed his confession. The inheritance of truth was finally his. After my father signed the confession, the atmosphere in the room deflated. There was no triumphant fanfare, no satisfying sense of victory. There was only the quiet, scratching sound of a pen as I, in turn, signed the document Ms. Reed had prepared, officially confirming that the terms of Clause 11B had been met. The great family war had ended not with a bang, but with the rustle of legal papers. Julian pushed his chair back and stood, not looking at anyone. He was a man hollowed out, the blustering facade stripped away to reveal the petty, insecure core I now understood had driven him his entire life. Aunt Genevieve, for her part, looked utterly lost. Her entire worldview, built around the unimpeachable image of our family and her brother's righteous narrative, had been demolished in the span of an hour. She stared at the signed confession on the table as if it were a venomous snake. Without another word, they both turned and walked out of the conference room. The door clicked shut behind them, leaving a profound and cleansing silence. Are you all right, Elias? Ms. Reed asked gently, her professional demeanor softening. I think so, I replied, feeling a strange sense of lightness. I feel free. The weight I had been carrying for a decade, the guilt, the anger, the self-doubt had vanished. My grandfather hadn't just given me the power to claim his inheritance, he had given me the power to release myself from my father's. I had no interest in the written confession beyond that room. I didn't need to show it to anyone or use it as a weapon. Its purpose was served. I left it there on the table, a final, silent testament to the day's events. I thanked Ms. Reed for her integrity and her kindness, and as I walked out of her office into the bright afternoon, I felt like I was breathing fresh air for the first time in years. In the weeks that followed, the fallout was quiet but decisive. My father got his money, I heard through the grapevine that his high-risk real estate venture was moving forward. He had won the fortune he so desperately craved, but he had lost everything else. Our extended family, once so quick to judge me, was now fractured and silent. The truth, it turned out, had trickled out. Aunt Genevieve, in a moment of crisis, had apparently confided in a cousin, and the story of Julian's deceit spread like wildfire through their social circles. He wasn't seen as a grieving son anymore. He was seen as a con man who had lied at his own father's funeral. He had the money, but his name, the thing he and Genevieve had prized above all else, was tarnished beyond repair. I never heard from him again, or from my aunt. Our estrangement was no longer a painful, open wound. It was a closed and sealed fact, and I was at peace with it. My focus shifted from deconstruction to construction, both literally and figuratively. My career in architecture, which had always been a source of quiet pride, became my passion. I poured my energy into designing spaces that were honest, functional, and beautiful, buildings with strong foundations. About 6 months after the meeting, Ms. Reed contacted me again. There was one final piece of my grandfather's estate to be dealt with. He had owned his workshop outright, separate from the main family trust. In a private codicil, he had left the small, dusty building and all of its contents to me. The first time I walked back into that workshop, the scent of old paper and leather hit me with the force of a memory. It was exactly as he had left it. Tools were laid out on his workbench next to a half-restored copy of Don Quixote. I ran my hand over the worn wooden surface, feeling a connection to him that was stronger than ever. In a drawer, I found a letter addressed to me, written in his familiar, elegant script. It wasn't a confession or a plan, it was just a note. He wrote about his pride in me, his regret for the lost years, and his hope for my future. At the end, he wrote, "Your father spent his life acquiring things. I spent my life preserving them. Never forget that what you build is more important than what you own. Your foundation is sound, Elias. Now build something magnificent." And that's what I'm doing. I sold my minimalist apartment downtown and moved into the small living space above the workshop. I've started my own architectural firm, working out of a drafting table I set up in the corner of that magical room, surrounded by my grandfather's legacy of restored stories. My firm specializes in restorative architecture, taking old, neglected buildings and giving them new life, finding the beauty and strength in their history and making them functional for the future. My life is quiet, but it is my own, built on a foundation of truth. My father got the money, but my grandfather gave me something far more valuable. He gave me back my name, my past, and a blueprint for my future. He completed his final restoration, and in doing so, he allowed me to begin building my own.